Good evening, Jean. Thanks very much for your time. Quarterly crime stats, a good development in principle, would you say?
Most definitely. Researchers have been calling for more frequent release of crime data for as long as I've been in the business, and this is a very good development that we are getting at least quarterly data.
Now, given that the data for this first 3-month period, which fell during lockdown, so it's completely skewed because of that very unusual time, can we really pull anything useful from the figures?
There are some things that we can get out of the figures, and there's some interpretation that one can do of the figures, particularly because the SAPS has been very good to give us the previous 4 years' figures. So what we can see is that last year was a particularly bad year compared to the previous years. So it makes the difference between this year and last year look even more stark if you compare the same time periods. Usually that time period shows a dip in crime, but last year there was actually an increase. It looks like an increase, particularly if you look at the violent crime like murder. And so what that tells us is that the dip that we see now is even more exaggerated if you only look at the previous year. Also, the dip that we see now, we must bear in mind that reporting a crime was not one of the reasons that one could leave one's home during lockdown. And so there might have been some effect of crimes that may not have been recorded, even if they did occur. There may also be a delay in registration of crimes, that people may have recorded them at a later stage. So we have to, of course, there was a large reduction in crime, and we saw that everywhere in the world where there was a lockdown. But we must also bear in mind these other factors.
Good point that you make there, but some people looking at these lower stats for the lockdown period might say, well, the answer to South Africa's crime problem is curfew, prohibition, the army and police patrolling the streets all the time. Do they have a point?
Well, this is one of the limitations of the quarterly crime data in that it gives you the whole quarter. So it gives you the sum of the crimes committed in the whole quarter. In the slides that were presented, there was a differentiation between lockdown level 1, the 3 levels that we experienced during lockdown. However, it doesn't show the trend by week. And if you look at the unnatural death data, which is produced by the Medical Research Council. Now, unnatural deaths is an interesting category. It's all homicides. It's also transport-related deaths. So those are, and it's other kinds of deaths like drownings, any kind of accidental death. So, but the vast majority there are transport-related and homicides, which are also related to curfew and alcohol. And what you see there is even before the alcohol ban was lifted on the 1st of June, you see a steady increase in the number of unnatural deaths, an unusual increase from that very low level that we saw in hard lockdown, which tells us that things were starting to change even before the alcohol ban was lifted. Similarly, after the new ban was put into place, we see that, and these figures go up until the week ending the 4th of August, we see that after the new ban was put in place, the stabilization was at a much higher level, despite curfew, despite the alcohol ban. In fact, it was at a level that we last saw in January, in the middle of January, when people went back to school, which is traditionally a low in the murder and crime figures. So what we must take from that is that the initial very low figures were about people voluntarily submitting to the lockdown. People were very invested in doing the right thing. And we see a tolerance for that decreasing as time went on, notwithstanding what the legal framework had in place. And I think what we can see is that it will continue at this very high, relatively higher level, even if we maintain the curfew and the alcohol ban.
Right, so it would only be a bit of a temporary fix, and people would find their ways around those really harsh lockdown rules. You know, some of the arrests of citizens for breaking lockdown rules, you know, moving alcohol around, selling atcha, some really arbitrary things, riding your bicycle on the highway. In many cases, it was criminalizing sort of mostly law-abiding citizens. Do you think it's important to follow through those people, that they continue to be processed through the justice system? Or do you think the courts have much more important issues that they should rather be focusing on, and those people shouldn't be facing anything more, really?
Yes, I think what's of great concern is in the statement released by the minister today. He mentioned the number who'd been arrested and the number who had been released on warning. In other words, they weren't kept in custody. And the difference between those figures was something like 120,000 people, which means that some people were not released on warning, and some of them may have spent some time in custody. And I think what we're missing in this picture is the long-term impact in trust on the police. As people become increasingly concerned that while serious crime goes on in the background, these relatively less serious, in their view, offences were quite strictly policed. And this is going to have a long-term effect on trust in the police, which will affect reporting rates. Crimes which are not reported cannot be dealt with by the police.
Indeed.
And in fact, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but you talk about reporting of crime, and that leads me to my next question. You know, there are some calls that because crime is underreported, I think Gareth Newham was telling our channel a little earlier of ISS that they think only one in 9 rapes is actually reported, and that, of course, speaks to trust of the system and trust of the police. But there are some calls that you cannot look at these crime stats in isolation. They have to be seen against the context of crime victim surveys, because a lot of people simply, they'll participate in a survey like that and they'll admit that they never reported the crime. Would you agree that we need a more integrated, more nuanced understanding of how we assess crime in this country?
Most definitely. SAPS needs to get away from the idea that a reduction in reported crime is a good thing. The 2 kinds of crimes are well reported in South Africa. Aggravated robbery, that's robbery committed with a weapon and with violence, and murder. And so those give you an idea of what the true trend. Not all aggravated robbery is reported, but it's the best reported. And if you follow those, you will find that those have been going up in the last 10 years, while at the same time less serious offences have been going down. And that must be interpreted as not a reduction, in a true reduction. It just means that there's less reporting going on. If you find that murder and aggravated robbery are going up and the other crimes are not following the same trend, it's a strong indicator that people are not bringing crime to the police, that they don't see any point to bring crime to the police. So you look at those 2 crimes as your lead crimes, and you then, what you really want to see is more people reporting the less serious crimes, because it means that there's trust in the police can then do something about it, they can allocate their resources appropriately, and what you want to see is murder and aggravated robbery becoming a diminishing proportion of the total crimes that are reported to police.
Thank you so much for your insights. Jean Redpath, a researcher for Africa Criminal Justice Reform at the Dullah Omar Institute at the University of the Western Cape.